The worst Civil War battles to be a soldier in. Imagine you're 20 years old. You've been marching for 3 days. You haven't eaten a real meal in over a week. And in about 90 seconds, you're going to stand up, walk into an open field, and get shot at by men you can't even see yet. That wasn't a rare moment in the Civil War. For thousands of soldiers, that was just another day. Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. Historians estimate that more Americans died in the Civil War than in every other American war combined. The Revolution, the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. All of it added together. One war fought entirely on American soil by Americans against other Americans killed more of us than all the rest of our history combined. But raw numbers don't tell you what it actually felt like to be standing in the middle of it. So today, we're not just talking about who won and who lost. We're ranking the battles that were, quite literally, hell on earth for the men who had to fight them, and explaining exactly why. Before we get into it, a quick note on how we picked these. This isn't just which battle had the most casualties. Some of the deadliest days were actually survivable if you were in the right spot. What we're looking for is something different. Which battles put soldiers in situations where death felt almost unavoidable? Where the terrain, the tactics, or just plain bad luck stacked the odds against the men on the ground. We got 6 battles on the list. We're going in roughly chronological order, and I promise the further we go, the worse it gets. Let's start in Tennessee, in the spring of 1862, at a battle so violent that even hardened officers said they'd never seen anything like it. Shiloh. April 6th, 1862, Shiloh, Tennessee. At this point in the war, nobody, not soldiers, not generals, not the public back home, understood what this conflict was actually going to look like. Most men on both sides had never seen real combat. Some hadn't even fired their weapons before. Then Confederate forces launched a surprise attack on Union troops camped near a small log church called Shiloh Meeting House. Many Union soldiers were literally still eating breakfast when the attack began. The fighting concentrated in a sunken road that soldiers started calling the Hornet's Nest because the sound of bullets flying past was so constant and so dense it sounded like a swarm of hornets in the air. Union troops held that position for hours, taking wave after wave of Confederate assaults at close range. Here's what made it uniquely horrifying. Artillery shells started fires in the dry underbrush around the battlefield. Wounded men who couldn't move themselves out of the way, were burned alive where they'd fallen. Survivors described hearing the screams and being completely unable to help. By the time it was over, there were more than 23,000 combined casualties, more than all previous American wars combined up to that point. And this was still early 1862. The war had 3 more years to go, and it was about to get far worse. Antietam, September 17th, 1862. Antietam, Maryland. This is still, to this day, the single bloodiest day in American history. Not the bloodiest battle, the bloodiest day. Roughly 23,000 casualties in about 12 hours of fighting. Let's talk about 2 spots on this battlefield because they tell you everything about what it was like to be there. The cornfield, a 30-acre field of head-high corn that changed hands roughly 15 times over the course of the morning. Union and Confederate units marched into it from opposite directions, and the fighting became so intense at such close range that soldiers described the cornstalks being cut down by bullets as if a scythe had passed through, and the men standing in it went down the same way. One Union general later said the destruction in that field was so complete you could have walked across it stepping only on bodies. Then the sunken road, a farm lane worn down below ground level by decades of wagon traffic, which meant Confederate soldiers had a natural trench to defend from. Union troops attacked directly into it, and for hours men were shot down at point-blank range with nowhere to take cover. When Union forces finally got a clear line of fire down the length of the road, the result was so catastrophic that soldiers renamed it on the spot Bloody Lane. Photographer Alexander Gardner arrived just days later and took some of the first photographs of American war dead ever seen by the public. People back home had never seen anything like it. This was the moment the war stopped being an abstraction. Fredericksburg, December 13th, 1862, Fredericksburg, Virginia. If you wanted to design the worst possible conditions to be a Union soldier, you'd basically build Fredericksburg. Confederate troops held the high ground at Mary's Heights, behind a stone wall on a sunken road. Again, a sunken road, with completely open, sloped terrain in front of it. Union commanders ordered wave after wave of infantry to charge directly up that slope. No cover, no surprise. The Confederates could see them coming from hundreds of yards away. 14 separate assaults were made. 14. Not one of them got closer than about 40 yards to the wall. A Confederate artillery officer reportedly said a chicken couldn't survive crossing that field, let alone a man. For the soldiers ordered to make that charge, knowing before they even stood up that the assault before them had failed the exact same way, this is one of the clearest examples in the entire war of soldiers being asked to walk toward almost certain death in plain view of the enemy with no tactical surprise and very little hope. Gettysburg, Pickett's charge. July 3rd, 1863, the third and final day of Gettysburg, and the moment that's become the single most iconic image of doomed courage in American military history. Pickett's charge. Around 12,500 Confederate soldiers were ordered to march 3/4 of a mile across completely open farmland uphill toward a fortified Union position on Cemetery Ridge. 3/4 of a mile. Try to picture that distance. That's roughly 12 to 15 minutes of walking in formation, not running, walking, because the tactics of the era required tight formations to concentrate firepower directly into Union artillery and rifle fire the entire way. Union cannons had a clear, unobstructed field of fire for almost the entire approach. As Confederate soldiers got within rifle range, the fire intensified even further. Roughly half of the men who started the walk didn't make it back. Some units lost more than 60% of their men. Confederate General George Pickett, when asked years later why the charge failed, reportedly said he'd always believed the Union Army had something to do with it. A dark joke about just how outmatched his men had been from the start. This is the moment that's often called the high water mark of the Confederacy, the furthest the war effort ever got before everything started to unravel. But for the individual soldier walking across that field, it wasn't about turning points in history. It was just open ground, no cover, and a very long walk. We've still got 2 battles left, and I'd argue the worst is still ahead of us. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did researching it, that's kind of the point. Drop a comment with which battle so far sounds the worst to you. Spotsylvania, the Bloody Angle. May 12th, 1864, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia. Specifically, a section of the battlefield known as the Mule Shoe Salient, and within it, a spot that soldiers themselves nicknamed the Bloody Angle. This wasn't a quick, decisive clash. This was roughly 20 straight hours of close quarters fighting in pouring rain across earthworks that put opposing soldiers sometimes just feet apart from each other. Soldiers fought hand to hand over the top of log breastworks. Men were stabbed with bayonets, clubbed with rifle butts, and in some accounts pulled across the barricade entirely. The gunfire was so constant and so concentrated that a large oak tree, nearly 2 feet in diameter, was cut completely through and toppled by rifle fire alone. Not artillery, rifle bullets. Think about that for a second. That's not a stray shot. That's continuous fire from thousands of rifles, sustained long enough to fell a tree. By the time the fighting finally stopped, bodies were reportedly stacked several deep in places along the trench line, and the rain had turned the ground beneath them into a red mud. Soldiers who survived it described it, even compared to everything else they'd seen in the war, as the worst close combat they'd ever experienced. Cold Harbor, July 3rd, 1864. Cold Harbor, Virginia. And if there's one battle on this list that best captures what it meant to be a soldier with absolutely no illusions left about what was coming, it's this one. By 1864, Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee had become extremely skilled at fortification. At Cold Harbor, Union troops were ordered to make frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions that had had days to prepare. The soldiers knew. That's what makes this battle different from the others. The men in the ranks could see the entrenchments. They understood the math, and multiple first-hand accounts describe soldiers the night before the assault writing their names and home addresses on slips of paper and pinning them to the backs of their jackets so that whoever found their bodies afterward would know who they were. They didn't expect to survive. They were preparing for their own deaths the night before, and they got up and made the attack anyway. The result was almost exactly what they feared. Union casualties in the main assault are estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000, and a staggering portion of that happened in the first 8 minutes of the attack. Some estimates say the majority of Union casualties that day occurred within the first hour. Ulysses S. Grant himself later wrote in his memoirs that he regretted ordering that assault more than any other order he gave during the entire war. For soldiers, Cold Harbor represents something different from raw carnage. It represents the psychological horror of knowing, with near certainty, that you were marching to your death, and doing it anyway because you had no choice. Honorable mention, Franklin. One more, quickly because it's too brutal to leave out. November 30th, 1864. The Battle of Franklin, Tennessee. This time it was the Confederate Army of Tennessee making a massive frontal assault across nearly 2 miles of open ground against fortified Union lines. In the space of about 5 hours, the Confederacy lost 6 generals killed and several more wounded or captured, an almost unheard of loss of senior leadership in a single battle. Some historians have called it the Confederacy's own version of Pickett's charge, except with even less chance of success. Here's the thing that stuck with me most. Going through all 6 of these, it's not just the casualty numbers. It's how many of these soldiers knew what was coming and did it anyway. Men writing their names on paper the night before Cold Harbor. Soldiers at Fredericksburg watching the wave in front of them get cut down and stepping forward anyway. That's not just violence. That's a specific human kind of courage, or resignation, or duty, depending on how you want to look at it. These fields are quiet now. Most of them are national parks, green, peaceful, easy to walk across without a single thought about what happened there. But for a few days in the 1860s, they were about the worst place in the world a person could be standing. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives, and I'll see you in the next one.